There must be a revolution in black studies if this term is to have any relevance or legitimacy as an intellectual project by the midpoint of this century. That revolution, that is, a fundamental restructuring, must involve, first and foremost, the full incorporation of digital technology into how we produce knowledge. It must develop stronger links to reconnect with African American civil society through enhancing structures of capacity building and resistance at grassroots levels in our communities. The new black studies must construct a new language for talking about race, advancing the material interests of most black Americans, halting the erosion of our civil rights and the material conditions of the African American people. And it must urgently document and carefully preserve our collective memory, rituals, and traditions, explaining to generations of black people not yet born and to the entire world the nature of our struggle, our human aspirations, and the meaning of our existence. These practical tasks and many others will require, frankly, a revolution in our thinking about the vocation of scholarly inquiry and the inevitable connections between knowledge production and power. This paper is not designed to be an exhaustive examination of African American studies programs in departments or the field per se, but rather an overview of the political context or conjuncture in which black studies functions today. A revolution in black studies should begin with a brief historical overview of how we reached the current crisis in the racial history of our country. Over 35 years have elapsed since the first institutionalization of African American studies programs at major, predominantly white research universities and liberal arts colleges throughout the United States. In only 3 years, from 1968 to 1971, about 500 colleges and universities formally established departments, interdisciplinary programs, and various institutes of black studies. More than one-half of all U.S. colleges by 1974 had in their formal course offerings at least one course designated as black studies. This spectacular growth was, of course, driven by the unprecedented numbers of African American students who entered white academic institutions during the period of the civil rights and black power. In 1960, there were barely 200,000 African Americans enrolled in American colleges. 3/4 of that number attended historically black universities and colleges. By 1970, just 10 years later, 417,000 black Americans between the ages of 18 to 24 years were attending college. 3/4 of that number were now located at predominantly white institutions. 5 years later, 666,000 African Americans between the ages of 18 to 24 years were enrolled in college, more than 1 out of every 5 in their age group. Similar gains occurred at every level of education. The percentage of all African Americans completing 4 years of high school more than doubled in only 15 years, from 20% in 1960 to 43% in 1975. The total number of African Americans under age 35 who held college degrees more than tripled in these same years, from 96,000 in 1960 to 350,000 by 1975. These unprecedented increases in educational access for black Americans were made possible in part by liberal public policies such as affirmative action, race-based minority scholarship programs, race-based recruitment efforts to identify promising African American high school students, and to offer them needs-blind admissions packages, which made it financially possible for them to attend college. One should keep in mind that the architects of these race-based affirmative action programs were frequently Republicans, from Earl Warren, who helped pave the way, to Richard M. Nixon. Republicans engage in a kind of Stalinist rewriting of the public memory about this. They were key architects, principal architects of affirmative action as we knew it. There was a general political consensus as well, moreover, between both major parties at that time that compensation was due African Americans as a result of the legacy of legal racial segregation, which had only been outlawed officially by Congress in 1964. As the language of the 1968 Kerner Commission report made crystal clear, America's racial dilemma was perceived almost exclusively within a black-white bipolar template. Quote, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal." The bipolarity of the black-white template within American society made it relatively simple for advocates of African American studies to argue for separate departments, for black cultural centers, for aggressive race-based recruitment initiatives, and for minority scholarships. The crisis in America was defined in black and white. As black popular culture also in the 70s began to have a truly major and fundamental shaping impact on white middle-class American cultural institutions and social behavior, the majority of white Americans did not overtly reject or oppose the argument for affirmative action type reforms addressing blacks' historic disadvantages. One measure of how liberal the racial consensus was during these years was, if those of us who were around recall, the national debate over the Bakke decision in 1978. In a narrow 5-4 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the University of California Davis's admissions program, setting aside a specific number or quota for minority applicants to be admitted. Writing for the majority, Associate Justice Lewis Powell rejected racial quotas, but strongly underlined and reaffirmed that the racial diversity of a student body comprised, quote, "a compelling state interest." As a necessary remedy for past discrimination, race could be legitimately used as a factor in awarding college scholarships and in other educational programs. At the time of the Bakke ruling, many African Americans, including myself, saw this as actually a retreat from racial justice. In fact, Associate Justice Thurgood Marshall, in a vigorous dissent from Lewis Powell, angrily declared, quote, "It must be remembered that during most of the past 200 years, the Constitution, as interpreted by this court, did not prohibit the most ingenious and pervasive forms of discrimination against the Negro. Now, when a state acts to remedy the effects of that legacy of discrimination, I cannot believe this same Constitution stands as a barrier," unquote. Right on, Thurgood. Sadly, the nation has moved so far to the extreme gutter of the ideological right in the past quarter century that progressives and social justice activists who deeply believe in the principle of a democratic and pluralistic America now find ourselves desperately fighting just to maintain the Baki standard from being erased entirely. It is also crucial to remember or recognize that most of these unprecedented gains for black opportunities within higher education and education overall coincided for the most part with the general expansion of the American economy and during a period where unemployment rates, comparatively speaking, were relatively low. Between 62 to 69, for example, overall jobless rates for African Americans fell from 10.9% in 62 to 6.4% in 1969. For black married males, unemployment rates dropped in these years from 7.9% to 2.5%. The historic wage gap in median household incomes separating blacks and whites narrowed significantly from about 50% to 60% disparity. At the same time, the percentage of the black labor force classified as white-collar workers, that is, professionals, technicians, clerical workers, managers, nearly doubled from roughly 13% to 24% in only 10 years. These economic factors played a major role both in the push to restructure higher education to incorporate scholarship on the black experience and forced many white Americans, for the first time, to frankly acknowledge that racial injustice toward blacks had been committed and that compensatory measures were necessary for the national interest. During the 8-year period coinciding with the Reagan administration, the state of black studies programs, as well as black access to higher education overall, both experienced destabilization and overall decline. Ideologically, African American studies programs in black cultural centers increasingly came under attack for promoting what was termed racial separatism. Reagan's Justice Department was overtly hostile to affirmative action, implementation, and the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, then headed in the early 80s by that ambitious black conservative, Clarence Thomas, essentially refused to enforce anti-discrimination laws. These political shifts did have a negative impact indirectly, on blacks' access and advancement in graduate and professional schools, and to a lesser extent, did affect black enrollment in undergrad school. Nevertheless, despite the destructiveness of the Reagan era, the socioeconomic balance sheet for African Americans, viewed from a historical perspective as late as 1989, still remained hopeful. This generally optimistic view was reflected, for example, in the title of the 1989 volume on race relations, edited by David Gerald James and Robin M. Williams, entitled A Common Destiny, Blacks in American Society. From the late 80s through roughly the mid-1990s, there was a second wave of sustained growth in black higher education. Nowhere near as spectacular as that of the 1960s and early 1970s, but substantial nevertheless. Universities that had refused to establish formal African American studies departments or institutes, such as Columbia University and University of Chicago, finally created something like them. Harvard University, which in 1989, at that time, had exactly one tenured faculty member in the Department of African American Studies, hired scholar Henry Louis Gates, Jr. in 1991. By 1994, Harvard had become home to the Image of the Black in Western Art photo archive, documenting 50 centuries of how people of African descent have been represented and, of course, misrepresented within European and North American culture. Gates and cultural studies scholar Anthony Appiah produced Encarta Africana, which in many respects fulfilled the original vision of Dr. Du Bois for creating an Encyclopedia Africana. Prominent public intellectual Cornel West, the appointment of influential sociologist William Julius Wilson, and many other scholars who have come in the process, created a stellar department by anyone's criteria. Beginning in the late 1980s, both universities and corporations began to promote, for a variety of reasons, what I call corporate multiculturalism. The shorthand for corporate multiculturalism is celebrate everybody, criticize no one. Diversity became our institutional mantra, a value worthy of corporate and even the U.S. military's endorsement and full support. Indeed, the triumph of corporate multiculturalism, one might say, was General Colin Powell's appointment as head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Schools, like Columbia, doubled their budgets to recruit blacks, Latinos, and American Indians into their graduate programs. The Mellon Foundation initiated a massive race-based fellowship program identifying talented Latino and black undergraduate students, encouraging them to enter certain doctoral programs. By the late 90s, over 1,000 Mellon Fellows at more than 36 institutions were receiving hundreds of millions of dollars for summer stipends, travel expenses, tuition support, and debt forgiveness. The Ford Foundation, after years of neglect, rediscovered its interest in black studies. And it began investing millions of dollars into key programs, such as those at the University of Wisconsin, Harvard University, Cornell University, and even City College of the University of New York, once its controversial Afrocentric chair, Len Jeffries, was finally removed from the chair position. Between 1989 to 2000, the number of African Americans receiving professional degrees rose by 70%. Between 1990 to 2000, black enrollments in law schools jumped 50%. Blacks earning PhDs doubled in one decade, with 1,656 new doctorates produced in the year 2000. What is curious about this second wave of black higher educational access, as well as the rebirth of growth within and flourishing at certain levels within African American studies, is that these developments occurred precisely at a moment when the black freedom struggle was undergoing severe demobilization and fragmentation. The NAACP tottered near political irrelevance under the ineffectual leadership of Ben Hooks throughout the 80s. In 1993-94, the Reverend Ben Chavis's brief scandal-plagued tenure at the helm of that organization pushed the NAACP near bankruptcy and political oblivion. Jesse Jackson, for reasons known only to himself, deliberately dismantled his own organization, the Rainbow Coalition. One day we'll find out why. In 1995, Louis Farrakhan's Million Man March indeed filled the Washington Mall. but he filled actually what had become, by that time, a vast political wasteland. In national black politics, a vacuum. But both the Nation of Islam and most of the black nationalist-oriented forces that had participated, and much to their amazement, had this massive response to the call. But you got to remember, people set out on the mall. Farrakhan made the call, but the march belongs to us. It should have told them what they needed was an infrastructure on the giddy-up right away. They didn't do it because they didn't know how to do it. They had had no training or any experience in non-sectarian, non-dogmatic, broad-based, pluralistic political organizing. They failed to construct an effective united front with local controls and democratic access to decision-making. Within a year, it was gone. A historic moment lost. I strongly suspect the social force that actually drove the second wave was the maturation of the African American middle class, and especially its most affluent sector, its professional, technocratic, and managerial elite. By the mid-90s, the children of African Americans who attended college, largely on race-based affirmative action scholarships, 25 years earlier, were now beginning to enter college. In the shape of the river, long-term consequences of considering race in college and university admissions, authors William Bowen and Derek Bach acknowledged that affirmative action never substantially addressed or even recognized class inequality within black and Hispanic communities. Their survey of 28 highly selective colleges and universities in the mid-90s found that 86% of the black students enrolled at those schools at that time were, quote, middle class or upper middle class. These statistics bear out the inherent class elitism that still overwhelmingly characterizes American higher education. Well, the best testament to that recently was the New York Times this morning. But this is what I have in my paper. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, as of '98, for families with annual incomes above $75,000, 65% of their children, who happen to be between the ages of 18 to 24, attend college. For families earning less than $25K a year, the figure drops to 24%. Research funded by the Century Foundation recently found that as of this past year, at the nation's 146 most selective universities and colleges, 74% of all the students who are enrolled in these institutions, nearly three-fourths, come from households from the wealthiest socioeconomic quartile in the country. Students from families in the lowest socioeconomic quartile, the lowest one-fourth, constitute only 3% of the students enrolled in the most elite colleges and universities. In terms of race, roughly 30% of all African Americans between the age of 18 to 24 now attend college. For Latinos, the number drops to roughly 20%. The modern assault against black progress in higher ed, and collaterally, the future of African American studies at predominantly white institutions as well, was simultaneously political, economic, cultural, and ideological. There was a dedicated, concerted effort by conservatives to literally turn the discourse of civil rights upside down. In effect, to rewrite the American public's memory about what had actually transpired in the 50s and 60s. Somebody on their side had read Gramsci. King's image, his words, were cynically manipulated, providing a posthumous endorsement for outlawing affirmative action programs. An important turning point occurred in California in November 1996 with the passage of Proposition 209, the so-called California Civil Rights Initiative. Winning by a margin of 54 to 46%, the initiative outlawed the use of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in many aspects of public life. Thousands of blacks and Latinos, confused by the language of the initiative, didn't understand that affirmative action would be outlawed in their state, and they voted for it. On the day of the referendum, the LA Times exit polls indicate that a majority of the California voters supported affirmative action programs and their continued existence. Nevertheless, those same voters, confused or not, approved Prop 209, making it state law. Now, as Ward Connolly, the Negro conservative who led the campaign, stated to the press, quote, "The past is a ghost that can destroy our future. It is dangerous to dwell on it. To focus on America's mistakes is to disregard its virtues." White moderates and liberals who had long defended race-based affirmative action programs waffled and largely collapsed before the conservative onslaught. Setting the tone was, appropriately enough, President William Jefferson Clinton, who in his re-election campaign in '96 declared during one presidential debate that, quote, "I have done more to eliminate affirmative action programs I didn't think were fair and tightened others up than any of my predecessors have since affirmative action has been around," unquote. Clinton's failure, his failure to frame the continuing necessity for affirmative action around issues of U.S. racial history, to be the national school teacher on the enduring significance of race, why it was important, how it speaks to the national character. What this is about, a moral commitment to justice and as fairness. His failure to do this, to lead, the need to implement measures of compensatory justice for historically disadvantaged groups would prove absolutely decisive. In 1996, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, in the Hopwood decision, outlawed the use of race as a factor in admissions to universities. Initiative 200 in Washington State in '98 followed California in outlawing affirmative action enforcement. As a direct consequence, in the first year of Prop 209's enforcement, the number of African American first-year undergraduates enrolling at the Berkeley campus fell from 258 to 95, a 63% decline. At the University of California at Los Angeles, the drop was from 211 black students down to 125. Advocates of affirmative action then largely jettisoned historically grounded claims to racial justice for blacks, tactically falling back generally on two more pragmatic approaches. First approach, race-neutral schemes, admitting a certain fixed percentage of a state's graduating high school seniors into a state university system. The other, restructuring formerly race-based fellowship programs to incorporate Asian Americans, low-income whites, others defined either as underrepresented or from disadvantaged backgrounds. Both of these approaches were, to me, highly problematic. The fixed percentage approach essentially rewards the continued existence of racial residential segregation, giving the greatest access to minority students living in hyper-segregated urban schools, but severely reducing college access to much more qualified African American students who attend mixed or predominantly white, more elite suburban schools. In Texas, the Top 10 plan was adopted in 1997 when Bush was governor. Following the Hopwood decision, almost immediately, both the University of Texas at Austin and Texas A&M, the state's two flagship institutions, experienced modest declines in minority student population. By the fall 2002, of the matriculating freshmen, African Americans comprised only 3% and Latinos under 10%, in a state where over 40% of the total population is Latino and black. In June 2003, the U.S. Supreme Court decided two lawsuits involving affirmative action programs at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Perhaps the most important of the two decisions, Grutter v. Bollinger, declared there was a compelling state interest in fostering programs enhancing diversity, and that the quality of education was enriched by having individuals from different racial and ethnic backgrounds as part of a university environment. Therefore, the court declared in its narrow 5-4 ruling the use of race as a factor was acceptable so long as it was applied as it was not applied as a quota. In effect, the Lewis Powell standard set in Bakke was still deemed constitutional. The initial response from the academic community was that Grutter represented a clear-cut victory for the forces of affirmative action and diversity. We unfortunately ignored the total weight of the majority's opinion on the High Court, that universities had to consider prospective students henceforth, quote, as individuals, unquote, and not reject or admit them through any programs based exclusively or even primarily on racialized categories. This aspect of the ruling was quickly interpreted by university attorneys. It took them a couple months, but by the end of 2003, they reached the conclusion that all programs within any college or universities could not be based exclusively or even primarily on racial categories. So from late 2003 through April 2004, in a relatively brief period of time, in about 5 months, literally hundreds of U.S. universities and colleges have shut down or significantly transformed their minority-oriented initiatives. The list is truly stunning. At Yale University, a summer pre-registration program for pre-freshmen cultural connections was opened to white participation. At Princeton, an all race exclusive programs, quote unquote, were abruptly halted, including its Junior Summer Institute, annually bringing Latino and African American college students to the Woodrow Wilson School for Public and International Affairs. At Boulder, the University of Colorado's Summer Minority Access Research Training Program was renamed and opened to whites. At Caltech, its campus visitation program, designated for Latinos, blacks, and American Indians, was open to whites and Asian Americans. At Indiana University, its 9-week Minority Summer Research Fellowship, originally designed to, quote, get minority high school and college students interested in medical research by matching them with mentors, unquote, was restructured to incorporate Asian Americans and whites. the St. Louis University, a scholarship program annually awarding $10,000 each to 30 African American students, was, quote unquote, disbanded and substituted with a new, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. scholarship. The scholarship was offered at a reduced $8,000 per student and accepting applications without consideration of risk. And at Williams College in Massachusetts, a pre-doctoral fellowship program, which for more than a decade, and this is very painful for me because I was personally not responsible, but I had a hand in convincing them to do it back about 15 years ago, that awarded annually 2 to 5 general dissertation stipends to Latino and black advanced grad students with the original purpose of increasing minority professors, a marvelous program that worked very well, had to be radically reopened, structured, to now anyone, regardless of race or color, who is deemed, quote, underrepresented. What does that mean? Well, quote, such as women in physics, or, my favorite, quote, white applicants in Asian studies. Upon reflection, based on this evidence, Grutter was no victory. It may mark a defeat that ultimately may help reduce the opportunities for educational advancement, perhaps for hundreds of thousands of Latino and African American students in the next decade, all in the name of preserving diversity. We must also be frank about the weaknesses of affirmative action, of which two, for me, are especially significant. Affirmative action policies first were crafted in reaction to the struggles and demands of the freedom movement. The central issue in the language of the day was the problematic status of the Negro in American society, or what they used to call the Negro question. Non-European groups who were not originally part of that national debate over racial segregation, Jim Crow, or who largely entered the country after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, did materially, substantively benefit in real terms from blacks' collective sacrifices. And we should say this. We should say this. By 2000, the overwhelming number of beneficiaries of such programs of affirmative action were non-black. In a recent conversation I had with Lonnie, she estimated that at this institution, about 70, I don't know where she got this from, 73% of the beneficiaries, she estimated, of such programs are non-black at Harvard University. In 95, several years after my arrival at Columbia, I agitated, enforced, persuaded the administration to create a standing committee of faculty, Minority Affairs Committee for the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, comprised of influential senior faculty, to substantially increase its scholarship funds to underrepresented minorities in doctoral programs. However, in growing numbers, individuals who, by traditional U.S. Census standards would have considered themselves and would have been considered in day-to-day interaction white, began to request financial support on fragmentary and occasionally even fictive connections with American Indian, Hispanic, Caribbean, or African American heritages or ethnic identities. and I've been the chair of that committee since its inception, I know. Some Asian Americans, who are certainly underrepresented in many of the humanities disciplines, have come demanding race-based scholarships for students who are pledged to study in the humanities. Some biracial individuals have attempted to make a case for themselves as a special discriminated class or caste worthy of relief. Affirmative action was a beneficial reform that perhaps could have worked well long-term only if race stood still. It doesn't. Race is a dynamic, changing social relationship, but grounded in social structural inequality. As the human composition of U.S. society's social order and hierarchy has shifted, the lived reality of structural racism also changes in everyday existence. Affirmative action, secondly, never in any meaningful way addressed the fundamental economic issue of structural racism. As my colleague and friend, political scientist Ron Walters has observed, affirmative action was essentially, in his words, quote, paycheck equality. Paycheck equality. It gave millions of, not exclusively, but over time, mostly, middle class or on their way to becoming middle class, mostly better educated African Americans opportunities for career advancement. It did not fundamentally alter the racial inequality and wealth ownership patterns within U.S. society. It was not designed to do that. The average African American household today owns only 12% of the net wealth held by the average white household. 1/3 of all black families actually have a negative net wealth. And that's hard to do. A negative net, 1/3 have a negative net wealth. The growing problem of inequality, to be sure, is not an exclusively racial issue by itself. Researchers Stacy Carney and William G. Gale in 2001 estimated that fully 1/4 of all U.S. households have virtually no financial assets. 20% have no savings or checking account. About 1/2 of all American families have less than $5,000 in total financial assets. The argument that the majority of Americans are therefore comfortably part of an affluent, great middle class is flat out wrong. But the race element is never incidental in the structural arrangements of American society. The lack of assets accumulation has been severely crippling to the development of all kinds of African American institutions and communities over the years. Affirmative action as an approach to racial reform did not address the necessary transfer of wealth needed to materially develop black communities, which explains why scholars, writers, law professors such as Charles Ogletree have pressed the issue of black reparations. You must find a way to address equity inequity. That is the fundamental contradiction that perpetuates the inequality that we see in daily life. There must be a massive wealth transfer, and I'm not talking about a check from a job. A massive transfer. How do we devise an argument to make that case in the national interest? I'm not just stuck on the issue or the phrase reparations. We could call it something else, if you like. But there must be, the way I put it prosaically, in the Great Wells of Democracy, a rendezvous with history. There must be a rendezvous with history. We cannot escape this. We must find a way to make that argument in the national interest. The rising generation of middle-class African-American young professionals may be ill-prepared for the post-affirmative action era we are now entering. Some of y'all will not like this. But speak truth to power. Many are so disconnected from social protest movements, the gritty struggles of their own people, that they may be unable to clearly interpret or even to understand what is currently unfolding in the public policy arena. In higher education, many have come to believe that their personal career advancement is based principally, if not solely, on their own merit, and that the severe reductions in the numbers of black graduate students or undergrads, administrators, and faculty will not negatively affect them. Others worry about the loss of affirmative action, but only from the perspective of the reduction of future possible career opportunities for themselves. Even many younger African American intellectuals I encounter who have liberal to progressive political views lack any serious theoretical grounding in political economy or practical intimate experiences working closely with black working people, much less grassroots mass-style political organizations, and consequently cannot fashion an appropriate praxis for becoming constructively engaged in the current struggles now being waged on the ground. This is, in many ways, perhaps, because it's not decided yet, but it could be, perhaps, the first black generation adrift from its own collective racial history. Affirmative action, and more generally, the philosophy of liberal integrationism, was largely responsible. It was largely responsible for this widespread historical amnesia, the color blindness among many under 30 blacks. Integration rarely asked black people what kind of American society they wanted. It only talked about what our existing socio-political structure could permit us to achieve. Integration emphasized individual opportunity and symbolic representation, rather than the substantive removal of the deepest structural barriers permitting inequality. Integrationists usually spoke a language of the nation state, not a discourse of internationalism or Pan-Africanism. They did not anticipate that after Jim Crow's demise, an even more powerful racial domain might be erected on its ashes, warehousing 1 million blacks inside of prisons and correctional facilities. They never imagined the disfranchisement of millions more. And oppressed people without total recall of their own history of exploitation and their resistance cannot craft a new language, cannot imagine a new history of liberation. With a few important exceptions, African American studies scholars were strangely outside of this national discussion on affirmative action. Drove me nuts. There are important exceptions. But on the whole, as a field, we're not in the mix. We're MIA. Many professional groups, predominantly white groups, disciplinary-based academic organizations, prepared eloquent amicus briefs to help shape the debate. Black studies as a profession did not impact the national debate, not unlike a band of frightened deer frozen in the headlights of an oncoming car. So the question must now be asked: can this field, this intellectual project, does it have the capacity to look backward and forward simultaneously? Much of the scholarship in African American studies is concerned with aesthetics, representation, identity, reconstructing the cultural knowledge from the past of our people, from our people's point of view. And all of this is very valid engagement. Yet at the same time, we must live our history into the future. We must constantly redefine the conceptual tools essential to address real problems that impact black people's practical daily lives. That means confronting reality without romantic, anachronistic illusions, or to paraphrase that great revolutionist Amilcar Cabral, telling no lies and claiming no easy victories. To respond to these challenges, black studies as a field must advance a more enriched theoretical discussion about the rapidly changing relationship between race, nation, and the state. Race, nation, state. Tony Marx did get it right, at least right in that framework. We can debate the book. Historically, the African American people simultaneously have pursued, I believe, two strategic goals under the general rubric of freedom, the freedom struggle, the freedom movement, equality, and what could be called self-determination. And there's like a lot of tensions, but those two. Equality, the achievement of full civil and democratic rights under the existing U.S. state, and the abolition of all structural barriers based on racial designation, was largely the focus of what we today would call the liberal integrations. Self-determination is a concept directly linked to the historical fact that the U.S. state was constructed indeed on a distinctly racial foundation. Citizenship was defined in explicitly racial terms for hundreds of years. The material oppression of African Americans has been carried out by the whole of white society, including white workers and the poor. Consequently, black people have I believe, an inalienable right to determine their own future regardless of whatever political institutions we live under. This is the ideological kernel of the black nationalist tradition in America. That's the essence of it. My argument here is that both of these historical tendencies within the rubric of freedom and the movement for black freedom have been made largely anachronistic by neoliberal globalization, the vast transformation of America's racialized ethnic composition. Does that formulation could it possibly have any credibility or viability, even as a general framework, romantic framework, for talking about local politically based initiatives and economic development in the rural South? But during a historical period where multinational corporations are surpassing most nation states in defining the economic realities of all of us, what viability does the anachronistic call for integration retain, given the dismantling of minority economic set-asides, the near elimination of affirmative action reforms? This is not an empty exercise, but a call for connecting theory with present-day practice. Black studies, in both its Afrocentric and liberal multiculturalist variants, has drifted toward becoming a stale academic commodity, more like a museum than an intellectual laboratory, largely disconnected and removed from pressing lived reality. It must be returned to the messy, concrete conditions to the always difficult contradictions constituting the stuff of black daily life, interacting with and boldly shaping civic discourse. The revolution in black studies as a field of critical inquiry demands the delineation of what may be termed as the new racial domain, the hegemonic paradigm for national race management that has been consolidated in the ruins of the post-civil rights era. This new racial domain is clearly more than a simple retreat or restoration of Jim Crow, but a complex reconfiguration of deep structures of race and power within the new context of political economy of neoliberal globalized capitalism. About 2 years ago, in my book, The Great Wells of Democracy, The Meaning of Race in American Life, I advanced the thesis that the prison-industrial complex was actually the central driving force behind this social transformation, this new racial domain. I now believe I was wrong, that the formulation, the way I phrased it, was too angular and ahistorical. A more dialectical approach would stress the intersectionalities between the divergent social forces and public policies and their effects, the existing institutions that are responsible for currently devastating the lives of millions of poor brown and black folk. Simply put, a matrix of the new racial domain is a deadly triangle, or perhaps an unholy trinity of structural racism, mass unemployment, mass incarceration, and mass disfranchisement, culminating for millions into civil death, the loss of the capacity to play meaningful roles within a civil society. The cycle of destruction begins with chronic mass unemployment and poverty. Real incomes for the majority of the working poor actually fell significantly during Clinton's second term in office. After the 1996 Welfare Act, the social safety net was largely ripped and pulled apart. As the Bush regime took power, chronic joblessness spread to black workers in the manufacturing sector. By early 2004, in cities like New York, fully 1/2 of the black male adults in my city are now outside of the paid labor force. By January 2004, the number of families on public assistance had declined to roughly 2 million, down from 5 million families on welfare back in 1995. Where did it go? New regulations and restrictions intimidate, as social scientists have documented, thousands of poor people from even requesting public assistance now. Mass unemployment inevitably feeds mass incarceration. About 1/3 of all prisoners were unemployed at the time of their arrests. Others averaged less than $20,000 annual income in the year prior to their incarceration. When the Attica prison insurrection occurred in upstate New York in 1971, there were only 12,500 prisoners in New York State's correctional facilities, to move this forward, and about 300,000 prisoners nationwide. By 2001, New York State held over 71,000 women and men in its prisons. Nationwide, 2.1 million are imprisoned today. About 5 million Americans today are arrested annually. Roughly 1 in 5 Americans now possess a criminal record. So it's not just black folk. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws adopted in the 80s, made in many states, stripped judges of their discretionary powers in sentencing, imposing draconian terms on first-time nonviolent offenders. Parole has been made much more restrictive as well in most states. And in 1995, Pell Grant subsidies supporting educational programs for prisoners were ended. For those fortunate enough to successfully navigate the criminal justice bureaucracy and emerge from incarceration, they discovered that both the federal and state governments explicitly prohibit the employment of convicted ex-felons in literally hundreds of vocations. The cycle of unemployment frequently starts again. In 7 states, the former prisoners convicted of a felony lose their voting rights for life. In the majority of states, individuals on parole and probation cannot vote. About 15% of all African American males nationally are either permanently or currently disfranchised. In Mississippi, 1/3 of all black males are unable to vote for the remainder of their lives. In Florida, 818,000 residents cannot vote for life. Even temporary disfranchisement fosters a disruption of civic engagement and involvement in public affairs that can culminate in what I call civil death, the destruction of the capacity for collective agency and resistance. This process of depoliticization undermines even grassroots non-electoral oriented organizing. The deadly triangle of the new racial domain constantly and continuously grows unchecked. Not too far into the distance lies the social consequence of these policies. What is that? An unequal, two-tiered, very uncivil society, characterized by a governing hierarchy of middle to upper class citizens who own nearly all private property and financial assets in the country, in a vast subaltern of quasi or sub-citizens, encumbered beneath the cruel weight of permanent unemployment or underemployment, discriminatory courts and sentencing procedures, dehumanized prisons, voting disfranchisement, residential segregation, and the elimination of most public services for the working poor and the impoverished. This latter group is virtually excluded from any influence in the national public policy discourse. Institutions that once provided space for upward mobility and resistance for working people, like unions, have been largely dismantled. Integral to all of this is racism, sometimes openly vicious and unambiguous, but much more frequently presented in a race-neutral, even colorblind language, where none of us are racist anymore. Black studies must confront this new Leviathan with something more substantial than tired ruminations about racial separatism or racial integration. The seismic shifts have created new continents of social inequality, transcending nation states and the traditional boundaries of race and ethnicity as we knew it. What is necessary is an original and creative approach that breaks from comfortable dogmas of every type, advancing openly a politics of civic advocacy, of democratic engagement for those most brutally oppressed. I'm not suggesting here a vanguard role for the intelligentsia of the black studies community. Rather, in the tradition of C.L.R. James, I am convinced that the oppressed on their own terms, ultimately will create innovative, courageous approaches and new organizations to fight for justice that we now can scarcely imagine. Rather, it is our intellectual and moral obligation to provide the scientific collection of information and to construct new methods of social analysis that must also be accessible and democratic, grounded in the day-to-day realities of how the majority of black people now live and work. Information technology and new media have not yet been fully incorporated into black studies curricula and research production. We could follow the lead of the American Anthropological Association, which recently brought together over 24 journals in their discipline under a plan to make within several years their contents available online for all. Imagine a digital archive containing the entire combined contents of all intellectual production under the aegis of black studies over the last 40 years. Everything. Everything. And going back in time, incorporating everything from Fine Lawn, Freedom Ways, Journal of Negro Education, Journal of Negro History, everything, the universe. Richly documenting the complex heritage and the extraordinary contours of the black intellectual production covering the last century. African Americans have nothing. We have nothing that is even remotely comparable to Steven Spielberg's multimedia foundation called the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. This foundation has compiled nearly 52,000 video testimonials or oral histories of courageous individuals, the survivors of the Holocaust. A similar digital archive documenting the human consequences of U.S. structural racism and oral histories from African American victims of state repression and racist violence might also provide a powerful educational argument on the debate around reparations. Such ambitious large-scale documentary projects probably would require the collaboration of several major African American institutions or programs. More modestly, individual programs already possess, if they have a video camera, the resources to initiate mom-and-pop local oral history projects on their own, documenting the complicated histories of large black churches and masjids, important local schools, community-based organizations, telling the stories of significant local struggles. Partnerships with public school systems could integrate these video archives into educational curricula, informing young black people about their heritage and illustrating how everyday people find the capacity in different ways both to resist oppression and to renew their distinct culture and heritage. The new racial domain relies upon the wholesale theft, memory theft of black Americans, many of whom are increasingly detached from their own legacies of resistance and struggle. We must urgently preserve and archive that collective knowledge to empower the next generation. In conclusion, any reconstruction of black studies as a field of scholarly inquiry must involve the immediate, and I mean immediate, remaking of its professional association. Nobody talks openly or frankly about the glaring disconnection between the tier of African American studies most prominent and widely read and esteemed scholars. You got about half of them right here at this institution, and the National Council of Black Studies, which ostensibly is our professional association, was founded in 1975. As NCBS evolved into a narrow camp of dogmatic Afrocentricity, most feminists, most progressives, most Marxist black intellectuals abandoned that structure, and for good reason. Nevertheless, by permitting the most dogmatic wing of the Afrocentrists to frame the general definition of what constitutes black studies for public school curricula in community colleges is to be highly irresponsible. Highly irresponsible. For serious black scholars to abandon real engagement is irresponsible and unforgivable. So we have a task to do. Major research institutes in African American studies, and we know who they are. You, us, a couple others. We ought to talk this through. We need to make a decision. Do we rebuild this thing, or do we create something new? I'll pose the question today. What do we do? We do not have a professional structure. Let's make a decision. Or do we come up with some other rubric that serves the professionalization purposes we require? I'm warning, if we don't make a decision soon, we leave ourselves open to a counter-assault from the right, and they will go after us. And that's a fact. That's a fact. Amilcar Cabral once described culture as a weapon of theory. In the context of anti-colonial struggle, history and the careful reconstruction of collective memory can play a similar role for African American interest under the new racial domain. The colorblind racists aggressively rewrite the public memory, incorporating selective imagery of Martin into their reactionary agenda, denying the truth that the United States was indeed constructed on the foundation of structural racism. They deny the weight of history, the terrible atrocities committed, the mountain of historically constructed accumulated disadvantage that overwhelms millions of brown and black people to this very day. The preservation and documentation of black culture and history directly undermines their scheme. It is time for black studies intellectuals to speak truth to power, breaking free from obsolete and obsolescent debates, finding the courage to reimagine our own people and what our collective destiny might be, to lend their insights and energies toward mapping the foundations of the next black revolution to come. Thank you. Always believe in ending it with a flourish. Okay, we have a limited amount of time. Hopefully I've been provocative enough to incite some discussion. This gentleman wants to jump in first. But I should apologize again for people who came in late. I have to, following the lead of my comrade in arms, Brother Cornell, have to hit and run because I have to be in Mississippi at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. So I have to leave in unfortunately, about 20 minutes. Yes?
Before you spoke about more dialectical approach, I didn't understand what you meant by a hegemonic paradigm.
Dominant. That is, what is the construct under which that creates a kind of common sense of how our social universe is organized. And I just use the term and use it the way that Antonio Gramsci, the theorist, used the term in the prison notebooks, and that it's generally used in cultural studies theory and in Marxist theory. That's what I mean. But it simply is domination. It's a construct, how things are organized. Hegemony is like gravity in a way. Like if I have something and if I hold it out here, if I let go, it'll fall. How do we know that? Well, you don't have to have a scientific explanation. You just know it, right? That's like hegemony. People walk around and say, you can't fight City Hall. Where did that come from, right? That's hegemony. The domination of certain ideas, concepts that form a framework for how people interact with each other in daily life. What I'm I'm suggesting is that old Jim Crow thing, black sign, white's colored, white's in here, that kind of model construct. I mean, if we really sat down with the NAACP leadership, other than Julian gets it. Kwesi, I don't know. I don't know. In fact, I do know. They have in their model, their head, a model of engagement around race that is a throwback to the old system. What I'm suggesting is we got to break from that. You know, this whole debate about the way people often frequently teach, to this day, African American history. They say there are two fundamental sides in black intellectual history: nationalists versus integrationists. You know, people want to be inclusive, the other people want to separate, right? And, you know, it's just a framework, right? And a framework is not reality, it's just a way to organize stuff. That's it, because in reality, black folk have been both simultaneously, conjuncturally, it depends on the situation. You know, a lot of nationalists I know are in the NAACP, like members. So, you know, what is this about? What I'm suggesting is that those historic orientations have run into a dead end. And I mean, we got to break from that, because the construct that gave rise to that is itself being radically and rapidly being transformed for all these reasons that I could not include here, but many that you can just take off. Transformation, mass immigration into the country, the Latino population in the U.S., and how that is being rearticulated. We can't think about race in hermetically sealed categories. Also with growing intermarriage. And millions of people of African descent, at least on the part of one of their parents, finding themselves predominantly as biracial. In that category. And how that functions within the society. And there's no need to have a nationalist fit about it. We just have to deal, I'm like Nello, I'm channeling for C.L.R. James, facing reality. Let's face reality and figure out how we can approach what we see in ways to enhance civic engagement, democratic discourse, and the empowerment of the most disadvantaged in the society. That is our task. That's where we should be held accountable. But that's what hegemony is about. That is it. Yes, Mr. Jones, you hear it.
You mentioned the possibility of losing a generation. And I thought about some of those persons you cited, Medgar and Martin and others. They were active in the 20s and 30s. Today, most of the black activists are over 50, local and national.
Well, 53, so that's
have we kept a generation so far back from the fires of political activism that they've never learned to cook?
All right, we could take a walk down civil rights and black power memory lane without waxing nostalgically about our political biographies. If we go back to the late 60s or early 70s, we didn't ask anybody. In fact, we were kind of like knuckleheads, because we didn't listen to the experience of us. We just went out and did it. St. Clair, who? Right. CLR, who? Right. Well, no, I was never that dumb. Right. I was just lucky because I was the tag-along in IBW. So Howard Dowson would say, Manny, go out to the airport, pick up Walter and Rodney. And Walter was hungry, so we went and got something to eat, and I could just talk to him. And I would talk. And he was very patient and kind, and he listened. I was like 24. And he was much older than me. He was great, So I was schooled in this, right? But I didn't wait and ask somebody for permission. We just did it. And usually 70s, realizing our own ignorance. Took off like about a year. I did it in Tuskegee. I'm not sure when you did this. And just had to read political economy and Marx and read stuff. And the classical literature. Yeah, right. I did later than that, like 76, 77, like by 2 years. Just having to read this, to learn it, and then to begin to apply it in creative ways. They are unfamiliar with any of this literature. And you might say, well, so what? What does this literature have to do with anything? The price of bread, and the price of gas, or whatever. Well, it becomes very hard then to really map your own intellectual tradition. That's the problem. That's part of the problem. That's just one problem. How do you read James? Or read Du Bois, his Black Reconstruction, or what he wrote after the age of, well, whatever he was, 64, 65. How do you understand Sinclair Drake and the universe? Is it mental universe? You must know something, the literatures, in order to critique. And you must also know the straight-up orthodoxy of the power that exists, that's dominant in our society. The classical literatures from Aristotle to Plato, Socrates, to the present day, as they define the canon in the classical sense. We must know all of that, all of it, in order to engage critically. And it cannot be done any other the short-circuit way. We must be able to do that, toe-to-toe. That is what they don't want. That's what they don't want. We have to be in their institutions and slug it out. Now, it's going to be hard because, it's like frequently I feel, like there's like 8 of us and we don't have we can't call for backup because we don't have it. But here we are, and we must fight it out, struggling to redefine and make these institutions more accessible, democratic, civically engaged, and responsible, socially responsible. And in that process, give vibrancy to our own intellectual content and our human existence as engaged scholars.
I wanted to make 2 points. One is, as you were talking, I found an analogy with your Malcolm X story. Because when Black Studies was in the process of making itself visible on campuses, one of the biggest issues for us, because I was part of that generation, was to make our knowledge relevant to the community. Remember, that was our mantra. We were going to be relevant to our community. So it wasn't taught by the young.
All right. Well, you wouldn't have had Smith, though, without Ella.
No, I agree. No, and I'm not taking away our role.
Okay.
But the shock troops were the young. And
That's
we
always.
can't, right.
That's
and
always.
We can't lead. I mean, one of the things used to, okay, I said things.
No. Go ahead.
One of the things that used to frustrate me, and it did, is my husband, Judge Higginbotham. He spoke out. And sometimes he was the only voice speaking out. You know, his voice would be in the op-ed pages. I used to say, as he is, you know, so sick, you know, like, Leon, somebody else needs to be speaking out. You're 70 years old, you know, like, where revolutions are fought by the young. And it bothers me that our generation definitely is a mentoring generation. That was C.L.R. James for us in the 60s and the 70s. But you still had a younger generation. And I'm worried about David. David, there you are. But they got to start cooking. You know? The young generation has to start cooking.
There is, wait a second, I see a lot of people, I want to do more gender, and the clock is rolling. Oh, there's a person in the corner back there, yes, you just left, yes.
Hi,
And then the gentleman.
Hi, given there's a significant number of people of African descent in the U.S. now who hail from the Caribbean and from Africa, I was wondering, first of all, what role do you see them in, or their experiences in shaping Black studies for the future? And secondly, I was just wondering what ties you see between Black studies here in the U.S. and other countries, kind of relates to the first question, other Black peoples of the world.
Okay, very nice questions. I basically take the view that African American studies, if America means the United States, can't go anywhere, that we have to explode that and get rid of the concept of that that's grounded to a nation state, which is not to liquidate the significance of the particularity of the experience based on this geographic site we call the United States, but rather to see that race, nation, state also involves the profound interconnections with regions across the entire globe. The Caribbean, perhaps more than any other significant geographical region, has helped in so many ways. If I could just give a lecture on it right now. Shape the consciousness, the culture, the history, the politics of African American people, of African Americans. So obviously there has to be tremendous, and other than maybe a dozen African American studies programs, it would be interesting to do a census or poll of Black studies departments nationwide, how many courses that focus specifically on the Caribbean that they have. I would say very few, probably, very few. Even less that look at Latino and Black interactions and connections, which again is criminal. I mean, it's not criminal, but it's perilous to us because look where history's going. That's the whole point of this conversation. That's what I'm saying. Look, scholarship has to redound. It has to resonate. Lived experience. What we see. And what we see is that 40% of Harlem speaks Spanish. What we see is that there's a long history of interaction between the Caribbean as a region and Black people in the United States. And our programs don't reflect that richness. It's tragedy. And it builds, again, the parochialism and the narrowness that ultimately culminates ideologically into a kind of dogmatism that allows for the construction of these infantile
very rigid Afrocentric kind of dominant ideas. It leads to dogmatism. We have to break that up, push it out. Part of what we have to do is the archiving of our own heritage. So I left out a whole section, which hopefully will be in this book, about archiving our intellectual heritage. And that's like that's the big passion in my life. Between Malcolm and James and a bunch of people I can't tell you about. Certainly I can't let Skip know. But yeah, right, because next thing I know, he'll be there. Right? So I can't let him know. So yeah, but he's doing that, I'm doing this too. You know, working actually for a common purpose. We're both doing the same thing. One more question to jump in.
One thing I appreciated about your lecture on Tuesday was how you discussed like history almost as a form of like political ideology and motivating political action and sort of the role of history. And it's interesting today because you presented sort of like an optimistic and pessimistic view of the future. And as you said, you take from James's conception that the oppressed on their own terms will determine the future course.
Not necessarily. Can.
Can.
It can.
Okay, but not necessarily.
There's nothing inevitable about it.
Because I was thinking in the terms of the other point that you made, that the new racial matrix, the new racial paradigm that you were describing, is partly based on robbing the disadvantaged, robbing the oppressed of their history, of a conception.
That's right. Memory theft.
I was going on the idea that the oppressed will, determine their own course of struggle. How does that work without a conception of this, or with this memory theft taking place?
Two things to keep in mind is a great social theorist once said, all human beings make their own history, but not in the way in which they choose. And you can't get students, they can't quote the 18th Brumaire off the top of their head. They haven't read. This is some sad stuff. Anyway, that's a sidebar to my friend. The classical theory. People got to know that stuff. But you don't have to apply it dogmatically. Just to know it so you can refer to it and use it in your own way. In your own way. Not even my way. I don't want you to be like, Manning Marable. I mean, just on your way. In any event, people live in history. We all live in history every day. That's how the lecture started on Tuesday. The oppressed people have a different sensibility about what history is to them. And as they live in history, that's what I meant in kind of prosaic way. Maybe all it is a ragged bundle of hopes that they cling onto. A sense of possibility in the next moment of what might be. For them, that is like a kind of history. That the boundaries between past, present, and future are in many ways ephemeral. And that we live in a process of flow. Where is this flow going? We have hopes, we have aspirations, but they're constantly being snuffed out. And people live at that kind of edge, wanting to create history, hoping against hope that they can. But they are trapped by the history that is imposed on them. And few, almost none of them will ever get out of it. And is that the story of black folk on this continent, the full story actually has barely been told. It has barely been documented. We have made such a small dent in the intellectual culture of the country. After all of the fussing and fighting of affirmative action and civil rights and all the changes, we occupy, at best, a tiny margin, a marginal position in academia. And they seek to take that, even that, away. We are now engaged in a protracted struggle, even for our existence in such institutions. That is on the table. And if you do not doubt me, young people. What has been given can be taken away. If the right wing wants to sustain heavy losses, as they would if they tried, but we should not give them the hammer. We have to think 3, 4, 5, 7 moves ahead. We have failed to do that. We have failed to incorporate the media. We have failed to digital technology. We have failed to professionalize the association. We failed to do all of these things that lend for the give them the hammers. Our Monica Lewinsky's that will allow them to smash us. Right? What I hope for is that a living history, this argument I'm making, can help people understand and value those ragged bundles of hopes. They do control for themselves. We're going to Mississippi. We're trying to develop a project with Merle Evers Williams based around the heroic figure of her late husband and linking that historical conversation about where we were to the fight to ensure that former prisoners are not disfranchised for life. Right? Looking to the future. Using history to empower. I think people get it if you explain it that way. So I am hopeful that the leap can be made. And, I went to a Quaker undergraduate school, Earl. I was brought up as an Episcopalian. So I have all the kind of socialization to want to have hopefulness that undergirds my analysis, but I could be wrong. And the decision of the change, the trajectory of the future is, and this is a nice ending point, is in your hands, not mine. I'll just be some words on paper in a library someplace. No, not even that. Probably, in cyberspace. But it depends on what this generation does. I'm just trying to wake y'all up. Okay? So this is a Jeremiah. This is a warning. And I want you to think about this, anybody under 30 in the room. And regardless, and this is not a race-based argument here. Okay? I mean anybody. We have gone through much. When I talk about Jim Crow, it's not something that is foreign to me. When I was a kid, growing up in the summers in Tuskegee, when we went down to the Dairy Queen, we couldn't go inside and eat. We had to stand outside, and we got the ice cream through a little window. When I was a kid, you went to the bus depot, you sat outside. You couldn't go in. You went down to the dry goods store. You went inside. You couldn't try on a cap or a pair of pants because you were black. When I was 13. So this is not something that is foreign to me. History can change through struggle. How can I ever forget that? I won't. But you never lived through it. I'm luckier than you. You have a harder go of it than I did. Because this is brand branded in my soul. It will never come out. So I always look and have that attitude. You're just reading this stuff, right? And I see young people that do not have that attitude, right? They miss stuff. I pick up and read. And I just say, woe be unto us. It's like they changed all these rules on minority programs. It's like a punch has been launched. It's in midair, coming like a roundhouse right. Stop, right? And black folk are about right here. It's going to hit. And people don't know it yet. But it's out here. Right? I'm not kidding. We're talking about thousands of kids who are going to lose opportunities. This fall. Does anybody care?
Yes.
I think the moral obligation is what do you young people do about it? Make history. And on that, I gotta go.